In this video, we're going to go a little bit farther into the foreign exchange markets. So in the last video, you learned about how to draw the foreign exchange market. So in this case, we're asking for the US dollar. So this is the US dollar market. So in the US dollar market, the dollar goes on the bottom of the exchange rate and at the bottom of the graph in terms of quantity. So it says to draw the effect of an increase in inflation in the US on the exchange rate against the euro. So if inflation goes up in the United States, the prices of goods and services the U.S. are selling are increasing, which means from the European point of view, the demand for U.S.-made products is going to go down because their prices have gone up. So in the foreign exchange market, we're talking about the demand for the U.S. dollar would also fall because the prices are relatively higher in the U.S., so the Europeans will find them less enticing and buy less goods, thus need less dollars in order to buy less goods. So very simply, because of that increase in inflation, the demand for the dollar falls, causing the exchange rate to decrease and the amount of dollars traded to decrease as well. So now on to the extension. So we've drawn the graph, the effect of the increase in inflation in the U.S. Demand for dollars falls, the exchange rate goes down. So B, based on your diagram of part A, has the U.S. dollar appreciated or depreciated? So if the exchange rate falls, then the US dollar has depreciated against the euro. Because its exchange rate goes down, that's called depreciation. Now for the extension, it kind of ties together the foreign exchange market and the balance of payments. So based on your answer in part B, which was that the US dollar depreciates, trust me, that says depreciates. Based on your answer part B, what would happen in the current account? So a reminder that in the current account is the trade in goods and services and exports and imports. So if the US dollar depreciates, the effect of that on the current account. So with the US dollar depreciating, that means that the US dollar is now more affordable to Europeans because it's gone down in value. It's now cheaper to buy dollars because of the depreciation. Because the US dollar is more affordable, so this is kind of like a two-part answer. Ultimately, you just need the second part of this. If the US dollar becomes more affordable, exports from the US are going to increase because Europeans are going to be able to buy dollars more cheaply and thus buy US goods more cheaply. So exports will be on the rise, as well as imports will fall because the dollar is depreciated. Americans are going to find it harder to buy foreign goods because of the relative exchange rate change. So that means there's going to be more inflows, exports, than outflows, imports. So therefore, the current account is likely to increase or go into a surplus as those exports now bring more money in. Now, at this point, you might be kind of questioning, well, wait a second, Mr. Nello. So we said that the demand for the US dollar decreased, causing it to depreciate. But then, ultimately, our exports will rise, causing the demand for the dollar to increase. And so it is kind of a teeter-totter effect in the foreign exchange market that an appreciating dollar causes exports to rise, which will cause an increase in the demand for the dollar, and the US dollar to appreciate again, but then an appreciating dollar cause less exports because they're now more expensive. And so it's kind of a teeter-totter effect the way that I think of it, and I'll kind of draw that on the next slide. So here we are at this point. We've said inflation in the US has risen. That caused the demand for the dollar to decrease because goods are now more expensive. When the demand for the dollar decreases, when the demand for the dollar falls, that causes it to depreciate as the exchange rate falls. The US dollar depreciation causes then exports to rise as they're now relatively more expensive. And in order to get those exports now, the cause being, or the effect of that being, the demand for the dollar rises, which causes the dollar to appreciate. Which means then that the appreciation is going to make exports more challenging for foreigners to buy, and that will fall, which then goes back to kind of the demand for the US dollar falling, and it starts all over again. So I like to think of it as a teeter-totter of the foreign exchange markets. Now ultimately they choose a starting point for you, and then they'll choose the ending point for you. And usually they don't talk about, you don't have to keep going round and round or back and forth on this. Really what you're looking to explain is kind of one of these effects, right? If inflation in the US goes up, demand for the dollar is affected, which depreciates it, which will cause exports to increase, period. That problem's over. All of that's kind of contained. They can start anywhere they want, though. If they start at the exports increasing, so if the U.S. exports increase, that'll cause the demand for the dollar to rise and the dollar to appreciate. But they don't kind of ask for any sort of back and forth thing, but just kind of notice that there is that back and forth that occurs. And then lastly, if we start with a current account surplus, and then what will happen in the U.S. dollar exchange rate. So if the American account, the current account, is in surplus, that means that exports are greater than or less than imports. So with a current account surplus, there's more money coming into the country, meaning that there are going to be greater exports than imports. When exports are greater than imports, the demand for the US dollar is high and increasing because foreigners are going to need US dollars to get US exports. And so that's another way that the AP exam likes to ask questions, kind of putting together the balance of payments and the foreign exchange markets.